A drone burst into a million fiery pieces, raining bits of plastic and scorched wire onto my tomato plants. One of my eagles, Talon, screeched victoriously as it circled overhead. Down the street, Karen, HOA president and resident surveillance junkie, was screaming something about airspace laws and government interference. I stood on my porch, coffee in hand, watching the smoke spiral up into the morning sky. "Yep," I muttered. "That's drone number 4 this week. You're probably wondering how I got here." It started with a letter. Not a handwritten note or a polite knock on the door, but one of those highlighter yellow HOA violation notices that shows up taped to your front gate like a passive-aggressive ransom demand. "Unauthorized structure in rear yard. Potential hazard to community aesthetics," it read. Attached was a blurry photo of what they were calling a structure, which in reality was just a reinforced perch pole I'd installed years ago for Talon, my eldest eagle. It wasn't even visible from the street unless you climbed a tree or flew a drone, which, as it turned out, was exactly what Karen Mitchell, our HOA president, had started doing. At first I thought it was a joke. Surely they weren't serious about siting a bird perch on a 2-acre property that wasn't even under HOA jurisdiction when I bought it. But I was wrong. They were deadly serious. The next notice came 3 days later. Violation, wildlife attractant activity. No further details. Then another. Unsanctioned avian installations, breach of architectural guidelines. That one made me laugh out loud. I imagined Karen, clipboard in hand, squinting through binoculars from her upstairs window, while furiously Googling how to evict an eagle. Her campaign was just getting started. Within 2 weeks, I'd received 5 separate citations, each more ridiculous than the last. One accused me of encouraging dangerous wildlife activity through persistent nesting behavior. Nesting behavior. That's what they called it when Ember, one of my younger raptors, laid 2 perfect eggs in a cedar platform I'd built in the tree line. It wasn't just ignorance, it was targeted harassment with a coat of bureaucratic paint. I'd been living on the edge of Juniper Ridge for 12 years. My property backed up into federally protected land, and I'd built my home long before the HOA extended its claws into this corner of the development. I didn't interfere with them, and until recently, they hadn't interfered with me. But Karen was new. She'd been elected HOA president just 6 months prior after organizing some bogus neighborhood beautification campaign and leveraging it into an administrative coup. From what I'd gathered, she was a retired marketing executive with a white-collar husband, a loud little dog named Muesli, and a terrifying affection for the words community compliance. Unfortunately for her, she had no idea who she was messing with. I didn't decorate my house for the holidays. I didn't gossip at the dog park. I didn't attend meetings with clip-art PowerPoints about mailbox uniformity. I rehabilitated raptors, eagles, hawks, and owls, most of whom had been wounded by power lines, wind turbines, or illegal traps. I'd been licensed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for nearly a decade. My land wasn't just mine, it was registered under a conservation easement with rules that overrode most local zoning laws. But Karen either didn't know or didn't care. That became clear when I caught her drone buzzing 20 feet over my back paddock one morning while I was feeding Haven, my blind golden eagle. The thing hovered like an obnoxious mechanical hornet, its lens blinking red as it zoomed in on the tree-mounted perch where Ember was nesting. I threw a pine cone at it out of pure instinct and watched it zip off toward Karen's house like a tattletale child. 10 minutes later, I received an email with a screenshot of me mid-throw and a subject line that read, "Evidence of hostility toward HOA monitoring efforts." I replied with a single line, "You're trespassing on federal rehabilitation land. Kindly F off." I kept the language professional in the actual letter I printed and mailed to the HOA, citing the 1974 Wildlife Rehabilitation Act and my easement code. But Karen wasn't interested in facts. She was interested in control. That afternoon, I caught her standing on the roof of her porch holding a remote control like a kid with a toy airplane, guiding her DJI drone back to its little nest beside her chimney. I waved. She didn't wave back. 2 days later, her drone returned, this time with a longer lens and, I noticed, an infrared sensor. And this time, Talon noticed it too. He was perched on the ridge of my garage, his eyes tracking the buzzing interloper like a missile locked onto target. The drone swooped lower, probably trying to get a glimpse of Ember's nest again, and in one smooth, terrifying motion, Talon launched. His wings beat the air like thunder, and within seconds he collided with the drone in mid-air, talons first. It exploded in a flash of plastic and whirring rotors, spiraling into the grass in front of my shed. Talon circled once overhead, victorious, then landed beside the wreckage and fluffed his feathers like he'd just taken out a threat to national security. I didn't know whether to laugh, cheer, or panic. Turns out, Karen chose panic. That evening I got a letter hand-delivered to my gate by a teenager in a lime green HOA vest who looked deeply apologetic, with the subject line, "Notice of Wildlife Hazard. Aggressive animal behavior." The irony was delicious. Karen's drone had been the intruder, the aggressor, the one breaking laws, and now she was accusing my eagle of misconduct. I drafted another letter, this time attaching footage from my wildlife cameras, which clearly showed the drone invading the nest perimeter. I sent copies to the HOA, to Karen's personal address, and to the city wildlife coordinator, just for good measure. The only response I received was a new violation notice: non-compliant aerial defense structures. That's when I knew I wasn't dealing with ignorance. I was dealing with malice. The following week, Karen upped her game. She launched a second drone, smaller, quieter, but faster. It zipped through the pine trees like a metal mosquito, darting in and out of my property boundary. I'd installed a decoy nest near the far edge of my land, and she seemed fixated on it. That's when Ember took her turn. She'd been watching patiently from a perch on the upper tree line, and the second the drone dipped below 30 feet, she struck. It was cleaner than Talon's takedown, no fireworks, just a swift snatch and a crunch of plastic as her talons closed around the frame. She dropped the carcass near the edge of the pond like a cat offering tribute. I retrieved it, dusted it off, and left it on the sidewalk outside Karen's house the next morning with a post-it note that said, "You're being watched too." I thought that might slow her down. I was wrong. She didn't back off. She bought more drones. She started citing me for excessive bird presence and accused me of maintaining an unregulated raptor colony. Her newest notice claimed I was operating a wildlife preserve without community approval. I pinned that one to my fridge like a trophy. The war had begun, not with lawsuits or fists, but with notices, talons, and spinning plastic wings. What Karen didn't realize was that I'd been preparing for a fight like this my whole life. She had a fleet of drones. I had an army of eagles. And the sky belonged to us. Karen didn't take the losses lightly. 2 drones down in a week had done something to her, something deeper than embarrassment. It was like she'd taken it as a personal insult, as if Talon and Ember hadn't just been defending their territory, but assaulting her authority. And that, I quickly learned, was the one thing Karen Mitchell couldn't stand. Her next move was textbook overcompensation. She didn't just replace the drones, she escalated. Gone were the off-the-shelf quadcopters from Best Buy. What showed up next was a matte black Autel Evo 2, dual 640T, complete with thermal imaging, 8K video, and a price tag that said, "Government contractor trying to be subtle." I watched it rise from her driveway one evening, like a stealth bomber, its rotors whisper, "Quiet," its red eyes blinking like something out of a dystopian sci-fi film. It hovered for a moment, right at the edge of my property, before drifting in like a mosquito with a badge. Talon saw it first, but I held him back with a soft whistle. This one was faster, smarter, and I needed to know just how far Karen was willing to go before I unleashed him. The drone zipped above my tree line, weaving between branches with a kind of unsettling precision. A hawk would have struggled to match it. But it wasn't just speed or stability that worried me. It was the purpose. This wasn't recreational flying. This was recon. The drone parked itself 20 feet above the old nesting platform I'd installed 3 years back and sat there, recording. for 38 minutes. I timed it. I even made popcorn halfway through, standing on my porch in my hoodie and boots, just staring at it while it stared back. Karen wasn't hiding anymore. She wanted me to know she was watching. The next morning, I found a violation notice shoved under my gate. Notice of community disruption, unauthorized aerial aggression and interference with community security operations. Attached was a printed photo, grainy and pixelated, of Ember mid-swoop, claws out, eyes locked on a now-deceased DJI Mavic Air. The caption? Documented threat. I laughed so hard I almost choked on my coffee. But beneath the humor, a chill set in. Karen wasn't just documenting eagle behavior. She was building a case. And like any good predator, I knew better than to let her outmaneuver me. So I went on the offensive. I installed 6 new trail cams around my property, 3 facing the tree line, 2 along the south fence, and 1 hidden inside the old barn cupola, pointing up. Then I mounted 2 of my older GoPros, both retrofitted with featherweight harnesses, onto Talon and Ember. Lightweight, non-obstructive, and tested for years during controlled flight sessions. I wasn't weaponizing my birds, I was filming them, capturing everything they saw from the sky, and what they saw was extraordinary. The footage that came back from Talon's first flight made my stomach twist. He'd followed the newest drone, the Autel Monster, as it patrolled across not just my yard, but 6 adjacent properties. It dipped low over the Petersons' koi pond, skimmed the edge of the Ramirez roof, and at one point hovered less than 5 feet from the Wong's upstairs window while their daughter was changing clothes. That one frame, a teenage girl startled mid-blouse with a black drone floating inches from her window, that was the moment the tone of everything changed. I printed it, blew it up to 1117, mailed a copy to every house on the block with a note, "Karen says it's about safety. You decide." By the end of the week, 4 different neighbors had called me. 2 were furious. 1 at Karen, 1 at me. The other 2 asked if I could help install privacy screens. But the best response came from Mrs. Halverson across the street, a retired Navy intelligence analyst who'd lived through 6 HOA presidents and referred to Karen exclusively as Generalissimo. She showed up at my door with a binder labeled Operations Log, Juniper Ridge Surveillance Activity, and said, "Been waiting 30 years for someone else to care about this crap. Let's burn the witch." Meanwhile, the eagles had made it a sport. Ember had started to track the flight paths by sound alone. She'd perch in the dead pine at the northwest corner, head tilted slightly to catch the whir, then launch like a damned javelin when the drone crossed into the meadow. I didn't encourage it, but I didn't stop it either. My job was to document. And document I did. I collected over 40 hours of footage, GPS flight logs, thanks to a cheap signal sniffer I'd installed, and time-stamped violation notes. I compiled them into a folder I titled Airspace Invasion, Exhibit A. Then I filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the county zoning office to confirm property line disputes and drone flight exceptions. It came back faster than I expected. There were no flight exemptions, no permissions granted. Karen was operating a civilian-grade drone with thermal optics across private property without owner consent. That was the legal term. The more accurate term? Spying. Her response? Another fine. This one for 1,250, labeled Repeat Pattern of Hostile Avian Interference with Community Oversight. I framed it and hung it in the outhouse next to a photo of Ember holding what was left of a DJI Mini 2 like a squirrel carcass. Then I called my lawyer, Nate Klein. Quiet guy, soft voice, used to be a prosecutor. Now spent his days defending veterans and taking on civil rights cases no one else would touch. When I showed him the footage, he didn't say a word for 10 minutes. Then he sipped his coffee, looked me square in the eye and said, "You realize this isn't just an HOA problem anymore, right?" I nodded. She's violating state surveillance laws, trespass ordinances, airspace rights, and possibly wildlife protection statutes. I nodded again. You got any paperwork to back up the bird stuff? I handed him my rehab license, my federal conservation easement documents, and the 1,987 bird sanctuary ruling that came with my land title. He flipped through it, eyebrows climbing higher with each page. "Yeah," he said finally, "we're gonna roast this chick." Meanwhile, Karen doubled down. She issued a newsletter, full color, glossy print, titled "Soaring Threats When Wildlife Becomes Weaponized." In it, she warned residents of a coordinated campaign of intimidation via rogue eagles, and claimed that several drones critical to community safety initiatives had been deliberately destroyed in the air by hostile wildlife under a resident's control. I read it out loud to Ember. She yawned. The next page featured a photo of Talon mid-flight, wings outstretched against the sunset, and the caption, "Known aggressor." It was so dramatic I considered submitting it to National Geographic. But what it really told me was that Karen wasn't afraid of facts. She was afraid of losing control, and nothing threatens control more than being exposed. So I kept digging. I mapped every drone flight with timestamps and corresponding video. I charted the proximity to nesting zones. I noted which drones were purchased on HOA budgets. Turns out 3 of them were bought under the line item Community Patrol Equipment, and traced the receipts. They were purchased on Karen's personal Amazon account and reimbursed through the HOA treasury, which meant she was not only spying illegally, she was being paid to do it. I brought this to the treasurer, Mr. Dunn, an anxious man with 2 hearing aids and a fear of confrontation that bordered on medical. He blinked at the receipts, nodded slowly, then said, "I thought we were buying radios." By this point, even the fence-sitters were starting to shift. I received an anonymous envelope in my mailbox one night with a note. "Karen's been hiding flight records from board meetings. Check the old archives. Basement filing cabinet. Drawer B. No name. No return address. Just that." The next morning, I paid a visit to the HOA office and asked for access to the archives as a concerned resident preparing a transparency appeal. Margaret, the secretary, hesitated then. With a sigh that said she'd long given up caring, handed me the keys to the basement. Drawer B contained exactly what I was looking for. 37 drone reports, flight logs, target zones, suspicious activity tags with resident names, including a 6 a.m. flight over the Gonzalez family's backyard listed as possible unpermitted hammock. My name appeared 15 times, each with a note like visible nest activity, aggressive raptor movement, and once, chillingly, subject appears to encourage bird-to-drone aggression. That was enough. The drones weren't Karen's toys anymore. They were evidence. And as my eagles kept winning the war in the sky, I was preparing to win the one in court. But first, I had one more surprise to deliver, and it involved a very special drone Karen didn't know I'd recovered from the pond. A drone that, once disassembled, revealed a hidden microphone and a data chip full of audio logs, including one where Karen said, and I quote, "I don't care if it's illegal. I want to see what he's hiding in those trees." Funny thing about surveillance, it cuts both ways. The thing about warfare, whether it's fought with drones or legal notices, is that escalation eventually hits a wall. And Karen finally hit mine the moment. Drone number 6 clipped the edge of Talon's nesting box and plummeted straight into protected airspace like a kamikaze with a GoPro. I was in the barn when I heard it, a sickening crunch followed by an eruption of wings and shrieks that sent feathers swirling through the late morning air. Talon, bless his prehistoric fury, didn't even flinch. He spread his wings wide across the rim of the nest, shielding Ember and the eggs beneath her like the living parapet he was. I ran outside, boots slamming into the gravel, and there it was, plastic debris tangled in the pine branches, propellers still twitching like a dying insect. The camera was intact. And more importantly, so was the SD card. That drone didn't just crash, it violated the most sacred zone on my land. The northern ridge, marked in red on every conservation map, etched into the covenant from 1971, and codified in the federal wildlife easement that came with my property. The no-fly zone, the nesting zone, the line even I couldn't cross without written permission and an escort from a licensed wildlife monitor. And Karen had flown straight into it like she was trying to start a fire in a fireworks factory. That was the moment everything changed. Not when the fines started. Not when the GoPro footage caught her drone peeping through people's skylights. Not even when Ember dive-bombed a quadcopter so hard it landed in the Ramirez's koi pond. No, it was when Karen's expensive, federally unlicensed Sky Spy physically impacted a protected nest that I finally went nuclear. See, I wasn't just some eccentric bird guy with a few backyard eagles and a soft spot for feathers. I was a licensed master falconer, registered with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Bound by federal conservation rules, covered by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, my birds weren't pets. They were wildlife partners under legal protection. And my land? It wasn't just property, it was a sanctuary, deeded and recorded in the county archives as a designated raptor rehabilitation and nesting preserve. There were plaques, laminated maps, and a file cabinet full of signed permits to prove it. And now, thanks to Karen's increasingly reckless drone games, I had a digital paper trail of federal crimes. I called my wildlife attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Nadine Trevorrow, who used to prosecute timber poachers and now spent most of her time turning conservation easement violations into public scandals with six-figure settlements. "Send everything," she said as soon as I told her what happened. "And keep the drone intact. Don't even touch it more than you have to. Chain of custody is going to be important." I did exactly as told. I put on gloves, collected the drone debris, and sealed it in an evidence box I kept for roadkill necropsy kits. Then I uploaded the SD card contents to a secure server and sent Nadine every violation notice Karen had issued, every HOA newsletter, and every time-stamped trail cam video showing her drones crossing into restricted airspace. She called me back 2 hours later with a tone I hadn't heard in years. "This is going to be fun," she said. What she'd uncovered was worse than I expected. Karen hadn't just violated a federal wildlife buffer. She'd done it multiple times, on record, while serving in an elected position of community authority. That meant she wasn't just a nosy neighbor with a drone problem. She was an HOA board president, using official funds to finance illegal surveillance over federally protected land. And that, Nadine explained gleefully, was enough to trigger an investigation by the U.S. Department of the Interior as well as the State Fish and Game Commission. "Oh, and by the way," she added, "that 1,971 easement? It supersedes local governance. Your HOA has exactly zero jurisdiction over your property. They're not just wrong, they're criminally wrong." She filed the paperwork that afternoon. By the next morning, I had an email from the DOI confirming receipt of my complaint, an inquiry docket number, and instructions to preserve all physical and digital evidence until further notice. Less than 24 hours after that, a white government SUV pulled up outside my gate, and a man in khakis with a bald eagle lapel pin stepped out, badge in hand. "Special Agent Darrow," he said, shaking my hand like I was a key witness in a congressional hearing. "We'd like to take a look at the airspace violations you've been documenting." I led him to the barn. We spent 4 hours reviewing drone footage, trail cam logs, and the complete topographical map of my easement boundary. He nodded silently as I played him the clip of the crash, the drone's final 30 seconds of footage before impact. It showed the nest. It showed Talon. And it showed the HOA board minutes pinned to my barn wall in the background, annotated in Karen's handwriting with notes like possible unlicensed activity and file complaint for noise. "This is gold," he said quietly. That same afternoon, the investigation expanded. Nadine had filed a separate notice with the State Environmental Review Board after discovering that 3 of Karen's drones had been purchased using HOA funds earmarked for Wildlife Safety Patrol, a program that didn't legally exist. The HOA budget showed nearly $9,700 in drone purchases over 6 months. Worse yet, the receipts were tied to Karen's personal Amazon account and shipped to her home address. She'd laundered HOA funds to buy drones that violated federal law and used them to spy on federally protected wildlife habitats. If you'd written it as a screenplay, they'd have called it unrealistic. But it was real, and the whole thing was about to blow wide open. Special Agent Darrow returned 2 days later with a state game warden and a wildlife biologist from the university. They interviewed me for 3 hours. I showed them the nesting records, the care logs, the rehab permits. The biologist examined Ember's nest and took photos of the drone wreckage still embedded in the branches. "Textbook violation," she muttered, snapping pictures. "They're not getting out of this." Meanwhile, the HOA board remained blissfully unaware. Karen issued yet another newsletter, this one accusing me of deliberate entrapment of HOA assets and operating an aggressive wildlife program with intent to harm community resources. It was so bloated with legal nonsense I framed it. But what made me laugh, actually laugh, out loud, alone in my barn, was the final line, effective immediately. "We are issuing a cease and desist on all raptor activity until the matter is resolved in court." As if you could tell a bald eagle to cease and desist. Talon stared at me from his perch, like he understood every word. I printed that notice too, and taped it to his perch. "You're officially outlawed, buddy," I told him. He blinked, tilted his head, and took a leisurely crap on the floor of his enclosure. That weekend, things hit a tipping point. The DOI sent formal notice to the HOA, requesting immediate suspension of all drone activity and all community patrol initiatives involving airspace surveillance. The State Environmental Office followed suit with a cease and desist order regarding all further HOA-funded technology purchases, pending review. Karen tried to hold a special emergency board meeting to rally support and silence me, but when she arrived at the community center, there was already a state vehicle parked in front of it. The meeting was canceled due to unforeseen legal complications. I know, because I was there, sipping lemonade on the hood of my truck, watching her walk back to her car with the grace of a collapsing soufflé. The next day, the HOA's own treasurer resigned, cited ethical concerns and possible criminal exposure. 2 more board members followed, including Margaret, who sent me a handwritten apology and a gift card to Tractor Supply. Karen, to her credit, didn't flinch, at least not publicly. She posted a 7-paragraph diatribe on the HOA bulletin board about corruption at the highest levels of government and accused me of colluding with deep state environmental agents. I saved that too. For the scrapbook. The investigation was officially underway. Karen's drones were grounded. The HOA's budget was frozen. And for the first time in weeks, the skies above my property were quiet. Talon flew undisturbed, soaring wide arcs across the thermals, while Ember guarded her nest in peace. But even as I watched them reclaim their sky, I knew we weren't done. This wasn't over. Not yet. Because Karen still lived 3 houses down, and Karen wasn't the kind of person who accepted defeat quietly, but I wasn't the kind of person who left a battle half-fought, not when the law was on my side. Not when the air was finally still, and not when the next move, the final move, was already in motion. I never expected to sue an HOA over a bald eagle. But by the time Karen Mitchell's fleet of flying peeping toms had harassed half the wildlife on my land and violated every state and federal boundary worth naming, there really was no other option. It started with a simple cease and desist, but that was just a polite warning shot. What followed was a full-scale legal aerial bombardment, the kind you launch when someone's hobby drone nearly slices through a federally protected nesting site, and then doubles down with a community bulletin accusing your eagles of intentional acts of property destruction. I remember sitting across from Nadine in her office, watching her flip through the pile of evidence I'd collected: drone receipts, flight logs, wildlife cam footage, easement maps, signed notices, HOA newsletters, even that ridiculous propaganda photo of Talon with the caption, "Known aggressor." She set it down, tapped her pen twice, and said, "We're suing them for everything: civil damages, federal violations, airspace encroachment, and throw in wildlife harassment for good measure." I signed the paperwork that day, and the lawsuit hit the board like a meteor. The name of the case: Langley versus Juniper Ridge Homeowners Association et al. It sounded like something off a primetime legal drama, but it wasn't TV. It was a reckoning. We filed for an emergency injunction first, which was granted within 72 hours, freezing all HOA operations involving surveillance or enforcement actions involving autonomous aircraft, cameras, or airborne technology. Karen tried to pretend like she hadn't read the notice, that is, until the Department of the Interior sent 2 agents to her house and seized what remained of her drone fleet, including a custom Mavic rig labeled Property Monitor Alpha. That was when the silence began. No more newsletters, no more violation notices, just cold stares through tightly drawn curtains. The first court date drew a small crowd. The press had caught wind of the case thanks to a leak Nadine strategically orchestrated. A journalist friend who'd previously covered an HOA scandal involving a guy being fined for having a non-compliant gnome. But this was bigger. Falconer sues HOA over illegal drone surveillance, read the first headline. By the time we got to opening arguments, the courtroom was packed. Front row, Talon's veterinary surgeon, my neighbor Mrs. Halverson, and a documentary crew from PBS. Karen arrived wearing a blazer the color of a bruised peach and a smugness that screamed, "This is all beneath me." Her attorney, a damp-looking man named Blevins, argued that the drones were merely community safety tools, that I had knowingly engaged in wildlife activity that exceeded reasonable expectations for a residential area, and, get this, that I had incited aggression in avian species for the purpose of weaponizing them. Nadine stood, paused just long enough to let the absurdity hang in the air, then said, "Your Honor, my client is a federally licensed falconer operating within a state-recognized conservation easement. The defendants flew surveillance drones into protected airspace, spied on him, damaged federal nesting grounds, and misused community funds to do it. If anyone's been weaponized, it's the HOA." And then she played the footage. Every frame of it. From the GoPro strapped to Talon's back, as he tracked Karen's drone across the property line. From the tree-mounted cams, showing drones hovering outside bedroom windows. From the recovered memory card that had captured Karen herself saying, "I don't care if it's illegal. I want to see what he's hiding in those trees." The courtroom was dead silent when that clip ended. The judge leaned forward, squinted, and said, "Is that the HOA president?" "Yes, Your Honor," Nadine replied. Caught on her own drone. Then came the whistleblower. Margaret, former secretary and reluctant villain in Karen's petty crusade, took the stand. Her voice trembled at first, but then she found her footing. "Karen told us we had to keep him under surveillance," she testified. "She said the birds were dangerous, and that if we documented enough provocations, we could force him to relocate. She even used HOA funds to buy 3 of the drones. I filed the reimbursement myself. I didn't realize how bad it was until that one crashed near the nest." Nadine asked her, "Did the board ever vote to authorize surveillance drones?" Margaret shook her head. "No." Karen added it as a line item after a meeting, then claimed it had been passed. That was the nail in the coffin. The judge recessed for 3 hours and returned with a ruling that read like an obituary for the entire HOA board. This court finds the Juniper Ridge Homeowners Association, under the direction of President Karen Mitchell, engaged in repeated willful violations of federal conservation laws, including, but not limited to, unauthorized surveillance of protected wildlife, trespass into federally restricted zones, and the misuse of community funds to finance activities that placed both wildlife and residents at risk. Effective immediately, the board is dissolved, its authority suspended, and a special receiver appointed to conduct a forensic audit of all operations. Karen's mouth was still open when the gavel came down. She tried to appeal. Of course she did. Claimed bias, procedural error, abuse of discretion. None of it stuck. What did stick was the $78,000 fine issued by the FAA for unlicensed drone use over protected airspace and another $25,000 penalty for violations of the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. Her husband moved out 3 weeks later. The "for sale" sign went up 2 days after that. As for me, I finally had peace. The eagles nested undisturbed. Ember's chicks hatched, healthy and strong. Talon took to sitting on the weather vane, scanning the horizon like a sentry on post. And I got to work on something I'd been dreaming about for years: a proper, full-scale rehabilitation facility. I used the court's awarded damages and a generous donation from a neighbor who'd been secretly rooting for me the whole time to break ground on a brand new raptor center. We built it right along the North Ridge. Stone facade, steel mesh flight cages, an education wing with classroom space for local kids, and a massive observation deck that looked out over the treetops like the prow of a ship. I named it Karen's Nest. The sign was carved in mahogany, letters gilded in bronze. Underneath, in smaller print, a sanctuary for raptors, free from harassment. Some people thought it was petty. I thought it was perfect. The grand opening drew a crowd of 200. The mayor showed up. So did a bald eagle from the Wildlife Service named Justice, who posed stoically for photos beside Talon. The local paper called it a win for wildlife and for every homeowner who's ever had to fight a clipboard-wielding tyrant. Karen didn't come, but her house sat across the way. Shutters closed, grass overgrown, price reduced, taped to the real estate sign out front. It stayed on the market for 14 months before a retired park ranger bought it. He came by one day, introduced himself, and asked if we ever needed volunteers at the rehab center. I handed him a clipboard. Sometimes poetic justice takes the shape of court rulings and civil penalties. Other times, it looks like a man cleaning out a house once ruled by a surveillance queen, while 2 eagles circle overhead, free and unbothered. I still keep the framed violation notice, the one that said aggressive bird activity. It hangs in my office, next to the signed letter from the DOI thanking me for my dedication to raptor preservation and community awareness. Some folks win with lawsuits. I won with feathers, patience, and the simple truth that when you go to war with nature and the law, you'd better be damn sure you know who's really watching from above.